So today's chat is about uh, landrace, fava bean, and peas. So the fava beans, their name in Latin is Vicia fava, and there's the one that we call the broad bean, which is this yolk here, which is bigger, and this one here is so that's fava, Vicia fava major, and this one is Vicia fava minor. They're more like tick beans, but they're also being used a lot now. We're looking for ones with white flowers. Normally they have like a purpley blue flower on white, but the ones with the whiter flowers is a sign that they don't have this bitterness in them. And I think that's mainly for turning it into flour. It's originally the bean that was used in North Africa. It's where it came from. Really, was kind of Eastern Mediterranean, and so you'll still find that in spring across North Africa and around the Mediterranean, where they grow them. And it's in Arabic, I think it's fal, is what they call them. So this is what you would make falafels out of. Falafels is
They're different than butter beans, are they?
yeah, they're what we would call broad beans, but I mean, you don't see them much in Ireland.
Yeah.
The Brits love them, kind of thing, and yeah, they're big enough for Europe and Mediterranean and Arabic culture. Um, so they're what's known as old world beans. So they come from Europe before we went to the New World in the Americas. So the old world beans are the Vesias, which, are, like I said, is a vetch. It's really a big vetch seed. And the New World beans are the Phasalis, the runner beans and the French beans and the dwarf and climbing beans. They're from the New World. So, funny enough, if Jack and the Beanstalk was written before we went to the New World, this was the bean they were talking about. It wasn't the like they're climbing runner bean. Um, so several years ago, I did a big grow out of as many different varieties as I could get. Um, and what we were looking at, I was down in Kilkenny at the time. We were looking at how were we going to produce indigenous feed for chickens? So, because all of the chicken food was coming in from outside the country, and we were looking at the fava beans because they're so easy to grow. In fact, this smaller one is like what we would call a field bean here, where they grow them in the fields and they're used for animal food. And the problem with them for the chickens was you would get this blood spot in the egg. So you crack the egg open and there'd be like a little spot of blood in it. And it was being caused by the vicine, which is the bitter chemical in broad beans. And we found out that the French had actually discovered a bean which had lower vicine in it, and but we never managed to get our hands on that. But one thing we could eat, just grows really easy, and most people grow it now in Ireland as as a green manure, and this is the reason why you grow it as a green manure, because if you see those little pinky white things on there,
Yeah.
they're rhizobacters. So they're a bacteria that lives in the soil, and what happens is they're endomorphic. They live inside the root of the plant. So all legumes will produce these in the right situation, the right soil. And what they do is they actually take nitrogen out of the air, and they fix nitrogen in their rootlets. So when you grow them as a green manure, you normally chop them in before they start to flower, when they start to lose a lot of that, because all the nutrients going to the flower to produce the seed, because that's the future. And so what you do is you chop these in before they go to flower, and then that kind of releases all of this nitrogen into the kind of root zone for the next crop that you're going to grow. And like I said, these are old world beans. But what happened when we take old world beans to the new world in Guatemala? So these are Guatemalan purple fava beans. So they're an old world bean from the new world, just to make things more difficult. So now if we grow them here, there'll be an old world bean from the new world that's old world. And on and on and on we go. So this I've grown them together. This small one here came out of Svalbard, the seed bank up in the Nordic seed bank up in the Arctic. I think it's Finnish or Danish originally. And I grew all of these together, but see what happens is in that first generation, you don't get to see what's actually inside the bean genetically. So whereas these all grew together and I saved all the seed, these are in that, they're in that, and they're in that. The genetics is mixed with them. And broad beans are really good for that because they're promiscuous. They really like to pollinate. They use bees and they use the bumblebees, and the bumblebee is perfect for it because it bumbles along. And it would go in the evening and first thing in the morning. You can smell the scent off of these. It's heavenly, off of the raw beans, off of fava beans, and that attracts the bees, and so they go along and they pollinate them. But they will self-pollinate as well if there were no beans there. So
they all go outside.
Yeah, preferably. Yeah, they don't like, if it gets too hot. So that's why we always grow them in the spring, because by the time they're ripening, it's getting too hot for them to grow, which is good because we want the seeds to senesce, to dry off, kind of thing. But if we were to grow them in the tunnel at the wrong time of the year, they wouldn't be able to grow very well because they like the whole of that leguminous family. They like it fairly cold. So peas, the old world I'm talking about, not new world. The new world ones come from a hotter place, so they like it warmer. But the peas, beans, lentils, things that we've been growing for a long, long time. I mean, 10,000 to 16,000 years, some of these. And these would have been like the early Neolithic farmers who brought bare barley to northern Scotland. They would have been travelling with these, using these in their farming.
So the modern broad bean seen it broad here.
Yeah.
That's not very. That's not an old broad bean, is it?
It's an old world bean. Yeah. If they're fava beans, which is the name for the broad beans.
Right.
They're all old world beans. Yeah. Very interesting because we hardly use them for cooking even, but they're amazing because you can grind them up and you can get flour, so you can use the flour and add it to wheat flour or whatever to get more of a lift in it because it's very high in protein. So that's kind of what they're looking at more and more now is protein, because they want to back off on the amount of animals that we produce, which is where our main protein is coming from, and look at alternative sources of protein. So more beans, and I've no doubt that the purple ones have a higher content of some phytonutrient in them because that's what the color is, But when you cook them, they go green. So although the genetics is all jumbled up, now what we'll do is we'll just grow these as a population. So this will be called a Grex, which is like 3 to 5 different varieties that you put together, and they're on their way to becoming a landrace variety. So when we save the beans, this is how we'll plant them, and this is how we'll save them, and this is how we'll eat them and grow them again. And so they become a population of loads of different colors that are in there. And as they cross with each other, they'll express more characteristics as well. And what that gives us, the chance that gives us is through our observation, we can also select and create lines out of these. So if we get, I was reading the book, The Seed Detective, and he managed to get into Syria just as the war was starting off. So he managed to get to Syria, to this place where it's actually a Roman site with a town in it. And he found massive broad beans that he got back from there. Big broad beans. You know, you'd have 5 of them in your hand, kind of thing. So they have the genetic ability to do all these different things, except that we won't be looking into it in the depth of looking at chromosomes and the locus and allelase to differentiate the genetics. We'll just be seeing where it takes us and selecting whatever it is that we want to eat.
Because you did that before, when you mixed them all before.
Yeah.
Where?
Yeah. Well, then,
Yeah.
I told you I was in Kilkenny. These are the result of all of those varieties.
You haven't done it up
in
here.
Kilkenny. Yeah, I mixed them in with a variety called Londonderry from Seed Savers. There's Whitcomb Major, there's Express, there's some long pod varieties in them as well. So there's quite a lot of genetics actually already in them.
When you decide on one, you say you want a particular one that you want to keep as a line.
Yeah.
Do you have to go that far away from?
If I wanted to isolate, I wouldn't grow the others with it, or like you say, I would take it somewhere else. They, because they're so promiscuous, you do have to have a bit of space in between them if you want to segregate 2 different crops. But the main thing is that, we'll be selecting the seed every year. So we'll be observing and then marking the plants maybe, and just taking the ones that we want, or maybe we won't even know until we open the pods what's in it, kind of thing. But then they'll be tasting them. So creating a landrace variety, the first thing you do is you bring in as much genetics as you can. You allow everything to cross in that first year, and then you take the seeds from those at the end of that year and you replant them. And so in that second year, you replant them and you leave them alone. You don't pander them, you don't do anything to them. You allow the environment to actually, you take out all the ones that don't grow here. And so in that third generation, the seeds that you get from those ones would have some kind of resistance towards whatever takes broad beans out here. Don't know about rooks, so they can be a problem. And then in the third year, what you do is you take the seed that you got from those that were culled out by the environment, the epigenetics, and you grow those, but at the end of that year, you taste them. So then you're starting to refine what it is that you're growing. First of all, you bring in loads of genetics, it goes mad, just they hybridize. And then in the second year, you allow the environment to take out whatever, with molds or diseases or whatever, your soil type even. And then in the third year, whatever's left from that, you start refining it for what you want. It might be that you want a high protein level in it for mixing with wheat, because this was always the problem in Ireland. Well, since I've been here anyway, talking to people from Teagasc and the Department of Ag and whatever, is that we can't grow good wheat for making bread here. We can only grow kind of like soft wheat, which makes biscuits and things like that. But it's absolute nonsense, because there wouldn't probably be anybody here if we couldn't grow wheat. We'd go back in time. So what they did is they didn't, if you didn't have a high enough protein level in the grain that you were growing, you just added peas or beans to it, and you ground them up into it. And it gives it a different flavor, kind of sweeter flavor. And because it's higher in protein, you get a bigger loaf rather than a flatbread, which a lot of people like. And because it's interesting talking to Joe the baker, because he has a bra for what he does. He's really into the baking, and so he studied the whole history of where bread comes from in Ireland. And he says, like, we would have been eating what everybody else was eating in Europe. We would have eaten flatbreads, oat cakes, whatever we could grow here. But then we would have used kind of sourdoughs to make risen bread, to make bread rise. But then, see, because we were colonized, we were dictated to. So it's a bit like when America took over Iraq and they started to dictate to the Iraqis what they could grow. They had the Iraqis growing a wheat that's used for making pasta. And the Iraqis don't eat pasta. but that's what a colony does. That's what, when you're colonized, that's what it does. So we started eating soda bread. Soda bread isn't an Irish bread.
Oh.
Soda comes from China. The factories in China, and I don't know where it came from before, but it was a thing that was foisted on the country at the time. It's not.
Not so bad was Irish bread.
It's not. Well, it is if you keep growing it, but it wasn't initiated by the Irish. It's not like an ancient thing. So yeah, we would have eaten unleavened bread, and then gradually, as people started to learn about using yeasts, you know, you couldn't go down the shop and buy a packet of yeast. You had to put your flour in with some wine or something to make it ferment and collect indigenous sourdoughs. So all of the sourdoughs around the planet are basically caught by making these little fermentation traps, and they'll be individual to the place where you making your sourdough bread. So San Francisco, because it's quite misty there, has its own sourdough, lives in the environment there. We have our own sourdough that we can collect from the environment here. You know, that's how it was. There wasn't a corporation behind it making sourdough packets that you could buy from Centra, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. So yeah, that's it. I put them in these so you can have a fondle, because something humans do like the feel of seeds. You know, there's something kind of, you know,
Very hard, aren't they?
yeah, they have to dry back. Yeah. To see what you do is you'd soak them, and then cook them, and then mash them, and then you could make falafels.
They take it long to dry them.
How long's a piece of string? It depends. You know, the thing with drying is you have to understand there's a gradual process. So you don't like throw them in the oven and dry them back. You just start by drying them back. So the first drying back is with them in the pods. So normally what I would do is, you know, they're dried. I cut them at the bottom, bring the whole thing in, dry the whole pod back, and then get rid of the whole plant in the pods, because I just take them out of the pods then, and then gradually dry. I have them indoors. That's what my house is about. Yeah, no, just anywhere, and they're just drying, you know, on plates.
Yeah.
And how you find out whether they've dried them or not is to hit them with a hammer, because they should shatter. They shouldn't squidge. They should shatter.
No big.
Wouldn't you soak those in chamomile tea before you?
Yeah. That's what I do. Apparently, I mean, the biodynamic guys or certain biodynamic guys use this. You know, just make up a chamomile tea the day before. Make sure it's not too hot. You know, make sure it's cool. Put the beans in, allow them to soak, and the chamomile is supposed to have an effect on the rhizobacter, to start calling the rhizobacter. It's funny because I think I've mentioned it before. A lot of these herbs that we use in medicines for, you know, like chamomile is good for settling your stomach and helping you sleep. Well, it's good for the stomach of the soil as well. So, you know, and they've done tests where if you grow, I think it is 4 or 5 chamomile plants in an area of grain, it increases the yield of the grain. But then if you go up over a certain level of the amount of chamomile plants, the yield goes down. So it's, you know, it's whether something's giving something, or whether it's having to compete.
Yeah.
Well, the dog got 2 speakers.
Huh?
The dog got 2 speakers.
Sleeping and happy and full.
And
So-
you plant those directly into the soil now outside.
Yeah. I mean, if you didn't have the chance and you didn't have the land ready, what I would do is 6 packs, and I'd put maybe 2 in each 6-pack, in each cell in the 6-pack, and then you grow them up and then take them out. But I mean, when you've got a big enough amount, you know, it'll take you forever to do that. So you're caught, because some of them you can sow before winter, but if you get a cold winter, you know, they come through the winter looking beaten up. All the leaves are ripped on them and everything. So I normally wait until February, but then you're getting into a dodgy time if you're trying to put anything in the soil, because it's like mud out there, like, you know, and remember just going down the field, pulling out the drill, and it was just slop, like, you know, put the beans in and then cover them over. And I think I told you, I used to do it with my dad, and one year we had a chisel and a club hammer, and we would knock the holes in the ground, and he would knock the holes in, and I'd come in and put the broad bean in after. And they grew, because by the time, they're very hardy once they get going. And yeah, once they start to grow, normally the weather's changing, so you kind of wait until after the snow. That's the kind of thing. Although you never know with Ireland, we can get snow in April.
But would you grow some of these outside there?
Yeah. So then the other thing is the peas. Piscium is the Latin for the peas. And I was reading about them, and there's quite a few wild pea populations around the planet. Well, Eurasia kind of thing. And so our modern peas are actually crosses of those old species. And this is what I always say, like, you know, people say, oh, you know, if you're crossing things, aren't you going to create poisonous and whatever? Our ancestors did all that work. They're the ones who died. They took the wild plants and they crossed them, and then they tried them, and then they, you know, they gradually developed them that they were more edible. And I mean, God bless the people in the Andes, because all of those, what you call it?
Solanaceae.
Yeah, Solanaceae. They're all poisonous. That's the deadly nightshade family, is what it is. So there must have been loads of cases of, maybe they knew. I mean, it's like some things, if you put it in your mouth and leave it on your tongue, but you don't swallow it, and your tongue starts to tingle and you spit it out, you probably survive. I don't know. But they're alkaloids. That's one of the problems, is alkaloids with Solanaceae. So I think for peas, it was just about size. And how do you know an old pea from a modern pea? Mostly old peas are really tall and modern peas are small, because one of the things is, you know, we haven't really developed the technology to harvest tall peas without using humans, you know, whereas the small peas can be combined. We've used peas in kind of polyculture. You know, the famous one here is pea barley mix. So, you know, it's mainly for cattle food. So, you know, they'll eat the barley and they'll eat the peas as well, especially if it's rolled or something like that. So you're getting a carbohydrate with the barley, and you're getting a protein with the pea, and they'll grow together. And like I said, the grain, the grass, which is the barley in this case, will take nitrogen out of the soil to grow, and that then will allow the rhizobacter to take the nitrogen out of the air that's in the soil, rather than take the nitrogen out of the soil, because nature doesn't do hard work. If there's nitrogen all around it, it won't bother trying to take it out of the air, because that's quite a process. In fact, it's a process that humans really haven't been able to equal, really. I mean, we use urea, which is used in modern agriculture, but that came about because of the war, the blockade of the Germans to get nitrogen from guano, which was wild seabird shit, off of the coast of Chile, which was used to extract nitrogen. They were blockaded, so they couldn't get nitrogen in, and so there was a partnership between two guys, Haber and Bosch, and they created this Haber-Bosch process, which extracts nitrogen out of the air, but it uses lots of energy because it needs to create a lot of heat and pressure to take the nitrogen out of the air, where there's about 4 tons over every acre of nitrogen in the air, in the atmosphere. But to get into the ground, you need a microbiology that's going to take it and change it into the form of nitrogen that the plants normally take up. So Yeah, so there's two different types. There's a round smooth one and there's a wrinkly one. So the wrinkly one has just one gene difference, and that difference makes it sweeter and more sugary. Um, what's this one called? This one's called Filler Basket, obviously, with descriptive about the crops that come off of it. So
It's like a
that's-
marifat, isn't it?
no, marifats are more starchy.
Are they
It's-
wrinkly though, marifat?
Yeah, they are, but they're almost like a cross. So
Sorry.
this one is the Irish green pea. Now it produces masses of peas, little tiny pea pods. So if you've got kids, they go wild for these because they're really sweet. But then when it dries, it's actually a smooth pea. So this could be ground up for making pea flour. For like I said, for adding to wheat flour or something like that. Seed Savers reclaimed this from the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg. But Vavilov was never in Ireland, so he must have got it from somewhere else. Maybe in America, he was in America and he was in the UK. And he was connected to all of the botanists and geneticists at that time. He was an absolutely great man. He was killed by the Stalin episode in Russia. And especially the opposite of him, there was a guy, Lukashenko, I think his name was. And they both had two different opposing ideas about genetics at the time. But Lukashenko's was more of a Soviet idea, that you could have a superior Soviet pea, where Vavilov's thing was, well, he was more the lines of Gregor Mendel. So eventually they picked Vavilov up as he was going through Ukraine. He went everywhere. He went into the most remote places on the planet and created a massive, great gene bank in St. Petersburg, which was the gene bank. It was the first really big one. It's still going now. But Stalin's KGB at the time, they picked Vavilov up and they accused him of all sorts of different anti-Soviet things, when he was driven by the fact that when he was born, there was two massive great famines after he was born in the beginning of the 1900s. And he was driven to try and create a solution for these famines. And instead of that, Lukashenko took over. He created another famine with these stupid ideas, but they were Soviet ideas, and it was all about superiority and nonsense. And meanwhile, they sent Vavilov off to the gulags, and apparently he died when he was thrown into a pit full of lime. And that was in 1960s. He was pardoned, but he is the great. He's like the father, and so every single army has a regiment that goes after genetics. So you invade another country. Alexander the Great did it. As he was going out along, going east, there was another train of horses and whatever, bringing back new varieties of foods and animals and things. And so this is what happened in St. Petersburg, or it was called Leningrad there, I think. The Siege of Leningrad, if you heard of this, where the Germans surrounded it and they just knocked the shit out of the place until it was a massive, great, I don't know how many days it was, but it was a massive amount of days that they held the people and starved them there. And the people who worked in the institute, they would be running out into the fields to dig up potatoes and things, and they were being sniped by the Germans. And that's what they were after. They were after the genetics that was in the St. Petersburg. They'd done it to other places and took it back to Germany. The other genetic resources they gathered, but they didn't get the St. Petersburg one. And the scientists in there, they had sacks of food, rice, peas, things like that. And they starved to death rather than eat the peas and things that they had then, because they saw them as, this is the future. This is, and not just the future of Russia either. They were, they were globalists. They were connected to loads of people around the globe at that time. And even today, foods that we eat today have traces of Vavilov in them. So like they're the heroes of seed savers. You know, they wouldn't touch the food that they were responsible for because it was genetic resources. So this is where this guy comes out of. I'll pass it around. It's a smooth pea, like I said. We also had another pea that was in the Vavilov Institute that Ireland said that it's called something O'Rourke. So Daniel O'Rourke pea, yeah? But since then they found out that, like I said, he didn't come to Ireland, so he couldn't have picked the pea up in Ireland. So where did he get it from? He got it from America. And there was a big, in the 1800s, there was a big pea growing frenzy. And so they're all growing different types of peas. And this guy in Massachusetts bred this pea, and he then sold it off to people who gave it the name. And Daniel O'Rourke was the name of the horse that won the Derby that year. And it wasn't even an Irish horse, it was from England, but the sire had been Irish. So it was called Daniel O'Rourke. So we have it here, it's our story in Ireland as being an Irish pea. But the story doesn't finish there. Because up in Lissadell House, up in Sligo, which was a big aristocrat's house, they had a head gardener there, and his name was his surname was Sangster, and there was a pea came on the market called Sangster's Number One, and years later they got DNA profile it, and it's Daniel O'Rourke. So it was very popular, Sangster's Number One, and this is what they did around that time was, say we got this pea here, the Irish green pea, and we called it Irish green pea improved. Yeah, so it was still Irish green pea, and it probably wasn't even improved, but it was a kind of commercial selling thing.
Am I wrong in thinking that most people didn't grow peas? I mean, they grew carrots and potatoes, but not.
Oh yeah, no, peas would have been grown in the garden because it's one of those things you can't access. Even if something like Calvin and Wonder, which is a really good early pea, which we could grow all season, which can be picked or combined. The hardest thing with peas is if you haven't got a combine, you have to pick them.
Yeah.
And I know from down there, picking a box of peas takes a goddamn long time to do. It's something that we should have peas, rows of peas, and the members come down and help themselves. Preferably with the children, because then it goes in as an experiential memory that they remember. Oh yeah, I remember when we were kids, we used peas were so good.
It's a great memory of a child.
Yeah.
Peas, I've been raw beans.
Yeah. No, I grew peas for my kids when they were little because it was one of these things. How can we go and pick peas? Yeah. And
The bee didn't grow.
yeah. And in fact, that worked very well until the ducks got out, and then the ducks realised that if they went near the pods they sucked the peas out of the pods and just left these raggedy pea pods hanging off of the peas. So, yeah, we'll be planting 3 of these. Also, they're inbreeders, and so they don't outbreed. So they have a pea flower. It has like a keel on it. It's called a keel, and the keel actually covers the actual flower in the insides, the anthers and the stamen and the stigma. So it self-pollinates itself. So if you want to create a new pea, you have to emasculate the flower and transfer the pollen from another pea flower and then isolate it, and then But there's a lot of interest now in the older varieties because of their height. Because it's like vertical gardening. So if we had a garden like this and it had walls all around it, and we were growing in beds here, we could use the walls to grow things up. And there's that permaculture town in the UK, somewhere up in the Midlands anyway, and they've actually even taken over the graveyard, and they're growing beans and peas in the graveyard, And what happens then? The whole village comes together. Podmorton, that's the name of the village. The whole village comes together once a year to harvest the village, And it started with two ladies who used to stand at the bus stop every morning, and there was a piece of ground there that had some shrubs in it. It was covered in dogs, muck, and rubbish and everything. And they said, "Can we put something more useful in here while we're waiting for the bus?" And so they put sweet blackcurrants in there, and it took off from there. Now the whole place is. They have a canal path, and that's all planted with apple trees down the canals, and it's called Edible Todmorden. That's the name of the
Have you
place.
ever
Yeah.
been there? No.
Yeah, and it just started with these two ladies waiting for the bus who just came up with this idea, and so now they're everywhere, the beans and everything, and they do things like, in fact, there's a guy in the UK who has one of the biggest collections of grains in the northern hemisphere, anyway. But he doesn't up to. I don't know if he's got a house now, but he was a what do you call it? Somebody who just lives in an empty house, squatter. He was a squatter, and what he does is that he gets schools and things growing them, and then they all have a day where they harvest it and they bring it in and they teach them how to grind up and make flour and then they make bread. And he was selling bread on a what do you call it? This isn't Todmorden. He was selling bread on a stall in a marketplace, and a Michelin chef came up to him and said, "Geez, we'd love to buy your bread." And all he had was a squat, and they built like a really wonky what do you call it, cob oven in the back garden. That's what he was making it on, the kind of thing, you know. So he said to the chef, "Well, you better come and have a look to see what you think." And like the house was half falling down, and so the chef was just totally blown away, right? You know. And this is the thing. We're all eating homogeneous foods, you know, that've been homogenized, and so we don't get any choice really on what flavor that we want. You know, to us, a carrot is a carrot, and well, we might have a bit more discernment about potatoes. I know Mary's dad. It was always a big discussion at the dinner table as the year went by as to whether these potatoes were good enough to eat or not, what potatoes they were. And like even my own grandfather, you know, what was it called? Home Guard. There was a variety of potato called Home Guard, and that's what he grew every year. And just people have preferences for different potatoes, but now it's all becoming a red potato or a white potato. A bit like apples, a red apple or a green apple. But we don't. Oh well, we're spoiled here because we all have apple trees, like you know. But people don't realise that the depth of flavours and nutrition that there is out there, because even as growers, we get fed seeds. If we don't grow our own seeds, we get fed seeds by the seed companies. And the seed companies are mainly concentrated on producing shelf life, so the thing can be sold, and quantity and maybe colour, not necessarily flavour. And not necessarily flavour in our environment here. You know, so they might be great if they're grown in the south of Spain, but you grow them here and they're not the same kind of thing, but you can get hold of the seeds. So everybody, you know, the one hybrid tomato that everybody wanted was Sungolds. And the other one was Sweet 100s, I think they were. There was the red one and the yellow one, but they're hybridized. And so you could never, unless you started a dehybridization program, you would have to keep going back and buying them. And then you never knew when the seed company was going to introduce a new variety and drop the old one. So now all over the world, growers are trying to dehybridize Sungold. And it's happening. You can buy kind of Sungold seed that's almost dehybridized. So you take it back to your place and you carry on dehybridizing it. But, you know, there's a lot of technology gone into Sungold as well, where it translocates the sugars to the fruits. And if we don't get a hot enough weather here, we won't get them that sweet anyway. So that's peas and beans, you know, fava beans.
Questions?
So this thing where you know the if they have native species of plants, it's better for the native wildlife.
Yep.
How does that marry with importing and modifying? beans and things, you know.
Well, yeah, I
Or
wouldn't.
getting an American bean, or
No, they're grand. They're grand. It just, if I suppose you you can't look at the farm as being one plant or even one type of plant. You have to look at the farm as being a system where you don't only have food crops growing there, or you have food crops that also give something to the environment. You know, it's all about give and take. You know, and the problem with most agricultural sites is they have no plants that go to flower. Cabbages, beets, you know, carrots. They never go to flower. So there's no flowers for any pollinating insects. So that if you want to grow something like squashes, where you need the pollinators, then you're in trouble. You know? So it's trying to, and not thinking that the farm finishes at the edge of the farm, because it doesn't. It carries on. What you do affects everything else outside of where you are. So yeah, it's big pictures, and to realise that, you know, we're only humans and we're in a stage. You know, we've evolved up to this level, and now we've never been in a better time for information. And the internet is kind of alive. Every mad creature is pulled out from under a stone, is on a computer somewhere. So I just joined this. It's free to join this group called Going to Seed. I thought it was appropriate. I joined someone called Going to Seed. Rather gone to seed. And these guys are way out there, and like my what you call it, my Hotmail inbox is just full of, and they're all looking at kind of hybridizing and land racing, and you know, looking at adding genes and different things, and they've already been doing it because there's another group called online group called Experimental Farm Network. And they're even further out there because they're looking at wild species and how to kind of start to domesticate wild species out there. But yeah, it's really exciting when people are kind of really going mad, and they're writing about Syrian cucumber seed that they got in the marketplace somewhere or other. And, you know, it's resilient to this and that. And there's a guy down in Croatia called Poop who was growing lettuces that grow out in the snow, and we're getting seeds from him, and yeah, it's just crazy stuff. But it's that it's not in all of us, but it's in some of us. This thing about growing, you know, I've talked to friends about it who are growers, and why would you do it really? It destroys your body, you know. It's hard work. Kind of doing it, you know, why else would you do it? And they can't answer that either. You're just because I have to, you know, because I want to. And we kind of even gone down into it thinking like, well, is it, you know, especially for males, is it this kind of thing of wanting to be a provider, or, you know, some kind of thing going on there? Yeah, but it's almost too much inside us to wonder what it is, because we know that there are people who don't get it completely, and we can't understand why. Why don't you want to grow anything? You know. And even if you say you're not going to grow anything, as soon as spring comes along, you're going to start twitching. The spring's here, and you want to get out, and that's where you differentiate the OGs, you know, the old gangsters from the youngsters. Is the youngsters will be out and they'll be hit by a couple of frosts, and the old people seem to go, nah. And there was a time, not in my lifetime, I don't think, where to make sure that the field was ready to be sown, warm enough. You go and you drop your trousers and sit down in it, because biologically your testicles are adapted to rise and fall with the temperature.
But I have heard that about the Datas.
Yeah.
You know,
And the Polynesians used it as well, because when they were traveling huge distances in their canoes, you can tell, you know, the nearer the landmass you are, the warmer the water gets. So there was one guy who was trained in dropping his trousers and sitting over the side of the canoe, and he could tell how near to the land they were by his appendages. shifting. I don't think it'd go down well now. I wouldn't even try it in my garden. But it just goes to show you, like now we use scientific, we use apps, and some of the guys in Tulabio now that will be here at the feeding ourselves thing, they've got biometers on their apps. They've got access to what are they called? Mass spectrometers. So what you do is you take you get some of your soil or whatever it is you're looking at, you mix it with a chemical that gives you a color, then you take a photograph and that's sent off to the laboratory where they can then look at the color and they can differentiate what's going on in the soil. But I think I'd rather trust my testicles than I would.
Okay.
Maybe we'll see that turning up in job descriptions. Anyway, I'll leave you on that happy note.
Next, any more questions? No. Thank you, Heather. Good practice.